18 months ago, Robert Chen was living in a tent behind the grocery store, digging through dumpsters for his next meal. Today, he owns the most successful custom furniture business in 3 counties and has helped 12 other homeless veterans get back on their feet. This is the story of how one small town decided to see potential instead of problems. The tent was army green, faded and patched with duct tape in so many places that it looked more silver than its original color. It sat in the narrow strip of woods behind the Millbrook shopping center, hidden from the main road, but visible enough that everyone in town knew it was there. They knew who lived in it too. Bobby Chen, the homeless veteran who had been part of their community's landscape for 3 years, as familiar and uncomfortable as a persistent problem no one quite knew how to solve. At 48, Bobby moved through Millbrook like a ghost trying not to be seen. He was thin from irregular meals and stress, his black hair streaked with premature gray, and his clothes, donated items from various charity drives, hung loose on his diminished frame. His eyes, when people bothered to look into them, held a particular kind of exhaustion that comes not just from being tired, but from being tired of being tired. Most mornings, Bobby would emerge from his tent around 6 a.m., roll up his sleeping bag with military precision, and begin the daily routine that had kept him alive for 3 years. First stop, the dumpster behind Romano's restaurant, where he might find day-old bread or barely expired produce. Second stop, the public restroom at Millbrook Park, where he could wash his face and hands in cold water and try to maintain some semblance of dignity. Third stop, the library, where he could sit quietly in the back corner and read until the staff's polite but firm closing announcements told him it was time to move on. The people of Millbrook had complex feelings about Bobby Chen. He wasn't threatening or aggressive, never caused trouble, never begged, never made anyone uncomfortable with demands or confrontation. But his presence was a constant reminder of problems they didn't know how to fix and realities they preferred not to think about. Some felt guilty when they passed him on the street. Others felt frustrated by what they saw as a failure of the system. Most simply tried not to see him at all. Bobby understood their discomfort, even sympathized with it. He remembered being on the other side of that equation, when he'd been Staff Sergeant Robert Chen of the 101st Airborne, when he'd had a house and a job, and the kind of life that allowed him to look at homeless people and think there, but for the grace of God. He knew that his current situation made people uncomfortable not because they were cruel, but because it reminded them how thin the line was between security and catastrophe. The catastrophe, in Bobby's case, had been a perfect storm of bad luck and untreated trauma. He'd come back from Vietnam in 1975 with wounds that didn't show, but never healed, nightmares, hypervigilance, the kind of emotional numbness that made normal relationships feel impossible. For years, he'd managed to function, got married, worked as a carpenter, built a life that looked normal from the outside. But the drinking had started as self-medication for the nightmares and gradually became its own problem. The marriage had ended when his wife finally gave up trying to reach a man who seemed to be disappearing even when he was sitting right next to her. The job had evaporated when his hands started shaking too badly to handle precision work, and his supervisor got tired of making excuses for his absences. By then, Bobby was so far down the spiral that he couldn't see any way back up. The VA had programs, but they required navigating bureaucracies that seemed designed to exhaust people who were already exhausted. Shelters had rules that felt impossible to follow when your brain was rewired for combat alertness in civilian situations. So he'd ended up in the tent behind the shopping center, invisible to most people and forgotten by the rest. On Tuesday morning, November 15th, Bobby's routine was interrupted by a problem he hadn't anticipated. His body was finally giving out. He'd been feeling weak for weeks, but weakness was nothing new. What was new was the way the world kept tilting sideways when he tried to walk, and the way his vision would occasionally tunnel into black spots that made him stop and grab onto whatever was nearby until they passed. He'd made it as far as the sidewalk in front of Miller's Hardware when the latest episode hit harder than the others. One moment he was walking, the next he was on his knees on the concrete, gasping for air and fighting to stay conscious. The world around him became a blur of concerned voices and approaching footsteps, But Bobby's primary emotion wasn't gratitude or relief. It was embarrassment. He'd spent 3 years trying to be invisible, and now he was the center of attention in the worst possible way. "Sir? Sir, can you hear me?" The voice belonged to a woman, and when Bobby managed to focus his eyes, he found himself looking up at someone who radiated the kind of competent authority that immediately made him feel safer. She was in her early 30s, with dark hair, pulled back in a practical ponytail, and wearing scrubs that suggested medical training. "I'm okay," Bobby managed to say, though they both knew it. "I'm Dr. Martinez," she said, already checking his pulse and looking into his eyes with the focused attention of someone accustomed to making quick medical assessments. "When's the last time you ate something?" Bobby tried to remember. Yesterday? The day before? Time had a way of blurring together when every day was exactly the same. "I'm fine," he repeated, trying to stand up, and immediately discovering that his legs had other ideas. "You're dehydrated and probably malnourished," Dr. Martinez said matter-of-factly. "We need to get some fluids into you and figure out what else is going on." She helped him to his feet with surprising strength for someone half his size and guided him toward her car, a practical Honda that spoke of someone who valued reliability over flash. "I don't have insurance," Bobby said as she buckled him into the passenger seat. "Good thing you're not paying for this consultation," she replied. Dr. Martinez turned out to be a veterinarian, not a people doctor, but as she explained while driving him to the urgent care clinic, mammals are mammals. You need food, water, and medical attention, same as any other creature I've treated. At the clinic, Bobby learned that Dr. Martinez had been right about the dehydration and malnutrition. But there was more. His blood pressure was dangerously high. He was showing signs of early liver damage from years of drinking, and he had a respiratory infection that had been slowly getting worse for weeks. While Bobby was being treated, Dr. Martinez made some phone calls. When he was ready to be discharged, she was waiting with a proposition. "My father was a veteran," she said as they sat in the clinic's waiting room. "Vietnam, same as you. Came home with problems that took him years to deal with. He used to tell me that the hardest part wasn't the war. It was coming home to a country that didn't understand what he'd been through." Bobby nodded. He'd heard variations of that sentiment from other veterans, but it never got easier to hear. "The thing is," Dr. Martinez continued, "my dad eventually got the help he needed. Not from the government, not from big programs, but from neighbors who decided he was worth investing in. People who saw him as a person instead of a problem." She looked at Bobby directly, and he was surprised to see determination rather than pity in her eyes. "I think Millbrook could use a project," she said. "And I think you could use a community. Are you willing to let us try to help?" Bobby's first instinct was to say no. He'd been let down by promises before, and he'd learned to protect himself by expecting nothing from anyone. But something in Dr. Martinez's tone, practical rather than sentimental, offering partnership rather than charity, made him consider possibilities he'd given up thinking about. "What kind of help?" he asked. "As an investment. We help you get stable, and you help us figure out how to do this better for the next veteran who needs it." That evening, Dr. Martinez, Sarah, as she insisted Bobby call her, called a meeting at the Millbrook Community Center. She'd spent the afternoon making phone calls, sending emails, and generally applying the kind of organizational energy that had made her successful in her veterinary practice to the problem of helping one homeless veteran. The turnout surprised everyone, including Sarah. Tom Wilson from the hardware store, Patricia Chong, who ran the local diner, Father Michael from St. Mary's Catholic Church, Janet Stevens, the librarian who'd watched Bobby read quietly in her library for 3 years, Mike Rodriguez, who owned the construction company. Nearly 30 people, all of whom had seen Bobby around town, but none of whom had ever really talked to him. "Bobby Chun has been part of our community for 3 years, Sarah began, standing at the front of the room with the confidence of someone who decided this was going to work regardless of obstacles. "We've all seen him, we all know he's struggling, and we've all probably wondered what, if anything, we could do to help." She gestured toward Bobby, who sat in the back row looking like he'd rather be anywhere else in the world. "Today I learned that Bobby is a veteran with skills and experience that could benefit all of us if we could just help him get back on his feet. I also learned that he came very close to a medical crisis that could have been prevented if any of us had simply a discomfort he was used to. So here's what I'm proposing, Sarah continued. We help Bobby get stable. Housing, medical care, the basics. In return, he helps us figure out how to be the kind of community that doesn't let veterans slip through the cracks. Not as charity, but as investment in someone who served his country and deserves better than what he's gotten so far. Tom Wilson raised his hand. What kind of skills are we talking about? Bobby looked around the room, took a deep breath, and stood up. For the first time in 3 years, he was going to talk about who he used to be. I was a carpenter, he said, his voice stronger than he'd expected. 22 years in construction before things went wrong. Cabinet work, furniture, finished carpentry. I can build pretty much anything out of wood. Patricia Chong leaned forward. Are you saying you can make furniture? Like custom furniture? Bobby nodded. With the right tools and workspace, yes. Mike Rodriguez was already doing math in his head. I've got a workshop behind my office that's been sitting empty for 2 years. Tools, workbenches, everything. Been meaning to rent it out, but never got around to it. My diner could use some custom booth seating, Patricia added. Been putting off replacing the old stuff because everything I can afford looks cheap. Within an hour, a Colorado Department of Transportation crew had reached them, followed by a tow truck that Daniel had somehow managed to contact using his radio. The highway was being cleared, and the Johnson family's ordeal was coming to an end. As the tow truck driver worked to get their Honda ready for transport, the lead plow operator approached Daniel. You the guy who's been keeping this family safe all night? The operator asked. Daniel nodded. Hell of a thing, the operator said, shaking his head. Temperature hit minus 22 degrees Fahrenheit around midnight. Without shelter and heat, they wouldn't have made it. Mark felt his blood run cold. 22 degrees below zero. He'd had no idea how close they'd come to disaster. As they prepared to leave, the family riding with Daniel while their car was towed to the nearest town, Sarah turned to their rescuer with tears in her eyes. Daniel, how can we ever repay you? You can't, Daniel said simply. And you don't need to. But if you want to do something, pay it forward. Help someone else when they need it. That's how it works. 2 weeks later, Mark Johnson wrote a letter to the local newspaper describing their experience and Daniel's heroism. The story was picked up by regional media, then national news outlets. Daniel found himself somewhat reluctantly thrust into the spotlight as an example of everyday heroism. When reporters called him for interviews, his responses were always the same. I'm not a hero. I'm just someone who was in the right place with the right training. Anyone would have done the same thing. But there's one condition, Sarah said as the meeting wrapped up. You have to let us help you with the drinking and the PTSD. Not because we're judging you, but because we're investing in your success, and we want to make sure you have every possible advantage. Bobby looked around the room at 30 faces, all looking back at him with something he hadn't seen in years. Expectation. Not the low expectations of people who figured he'd fail, but the high expectations of people who believed he could succeed. Okay, he said simply. Let's try it. The transformation didn't happen overnight. Bobby's first few weeks in the workshop were difficult. His hands had lost some of their steadiness. His tools felt foreign after years of disuse, and the simple act of showing up every day felt overwhelming when he'd spent so long without structure or purpose. But the community that had decided to invest in him proved to be patient and persistent. When Bobby's hands shook too badly to make precise cuts, Tom Wilson suggested he start with simpler projects to rebuild his confidence. When nightmares kept him awake and made him too tired to work, Dr. Martinez connected him with a VA counselor who specialized in PTSD treatment for Vietnam veterans. When Bobby relapsed and didn't show up to the workshop for 3 days, Father Michael didn't lecture him. He just brought him coffee and asked if he wanted to talk about what had triggered the drinking episode. Slowly, project by project, day by day, Bobby began to remember who he used to be. The first booth table he completed for Patricia's diner was rough around the edges, but it was solid and functional. The second was better. By the fourth, people were stopping to admire the craftsmanship and asking Patricia where she'd found such beautiful work. Smith's, a dining room set for a family 3 towns over who'd heard about the homeless veteran who'd become Millbrook's master carpenter. 8 months after that first community meeting, Bobby Chun was able to rent his own apartment. A year later, he'd saved enough money to buy the workshop space for Mike Rodriguez and was employing 2 part-time assistants. 18 months later, Chen Custom Furniture had a waiting list 3 months long and had been featured in a regional magazine as one of the area's premier craftsmen. But the real measure of Bobby's transformation wasn't in his business success. It was in what he did with that success. The second homeless veteran to benefit from Millbrook's model was Maria Santos, a Navy veteran with 2 children who'd been living in their car after her husband's death. Bobby worked with Sarah Martinez to create a support plan that included housing assistance, job training, and the kind of community support network that had saved his own life. The third was James Wilson, an Iraq veteran struggling with traumatic brain injury and unable to hold down traditional employment. Bobby taught him basic woodworking skills and eventually hired him as a full-time assistant, adapting work schedules and responsibilities to accommodate James's limitations. By the time Bobby's story was 2 years old, Millbrook had helped 7 homeless veterans get back on their feet, and their model was being studied by other communities looking for the thing people don't understand about homelessness, Bobby said during a presentation to social workers from 3 counties, is that it's not really about not having a house. It's about not having a place in the community. Once people decided I belonged here, once they saw me as an asset instead of a problem, everything else became possible. 3 years after collapsing on the sidewalk in front of Miller's Hardware, Bobby Chen stood in his workshop, now expanded to include a showroom and office space, putting the finishing touches on a custom dining set that would sell for more money than he used to make in 6 months. But he wasn't thinking about the money. He was thinking about the phone call he'd received that morning from Dr. Martinez, who'd found another veteran who needed help. Someone who'd been living in his car for 2 months, someone with skills and potential who just needed a community willing to invest in his success. Bobby had already cleared space in his workshop and started planning the conversation that would begin with a simple question. What kind of work did you do before? Because that's what he'd learned in his journey from tent to triumph. Everyone has skills. Everyone has potential. Everyone deserves a community that sees them as an asset rather than a problem. Sometimes it just takes one person willing to ask the right questions and 30 neighbors willing to believe in the answers. And sometimes that's enough to transform not just one life, but an entire community's understanding of what's possible when people decide that helping each other isn't just the right thing to do. It's the smart thing to do. Bobby Chen had learned to build more than furniture in his workshop. He'd learned to build hope, opportunity, and the kind of community that doesn't let anyone fall through the cracks. And in a world that often seemed designed to make people invisible, that was the most valuable thing he could possibly create.